The worst heartbreak isn't watching the person you love choose someone else. It's realizing they never stopped looking at you while they did it. I still remember the exact sound of the apartment door unlocking that Friday night. It was 8:17 p.m., just a few minutes after I had taken a frozen pizza out of the oven, and I figured Mason had finally finished another exhausting shift at the architecture firm. What I didn't expect was the soft laugh that floated in before he did. A woman's laugh. Light, confident, comfortable. My hand froze around the pizza cutter as footsteps echoed through the hallway. Then Mason appeared first, still wearing his charcoal gray coat. His dark hair slightly messy from the chilly October wind, holding the door open for a blonde woman about our age. She carried a paper bag from an expensive bakery downtown and smiled as if she already belonged there. "Nice place," she said, looking around our apartment. "It's smaller than I imagined." Mason answered with a quiet chuckle, but before he could respond, his eyes drifted toward me. Not just a quick glance. He actually looked at me, long enough that I forgot to breathe. "Hey, Ethan," he finally said. "Didn't know you'd still be up." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just making dinner. Hope we're not interrupting." Again, he looked directly at me while saying it, even though the woman beside him was the obvious guest. I shrugged. "It's your apartment too." She stepped forward and introduced herself with an easy smile. "Hi, I'm Claire." "Ethan," I answered, shaking her hand. She was friendly, pretty, effortlessly confident. The kind of woman everyone noticed the second she walked into a room. I figured Mason had finally met someone. Honestly, it made sense. He was 28, ridiculously good-looking without trying, 6'2", calm, responsible, the type of guy strangers trusted within minutes. Women smiled at him everywhere we went, and he usually smiled back just enough to be polite. I had always wondered why he never dated any of them. Maybe tonight was different. Maybe Claire was the reason. They settled onto the couch while I carried my dinner to the small table by the window. I tried not to pay attention. Really, I did. But every few seconds I felt something impossible to ignore. I looked up once. Mason was already looking at me. I glanced back down. Maybe I imagined it. A minute later, Claire was telling a story about getting lost trying to find our building. She laughed halfway through it, but Mason wasn't laughing with her. He was staring across the room. At me. Our eyes met again. He looked away first. My stomach tightened for reasons I couldn't explain. Maybe he wanted another slice of pizza. Maybe he thought I was being rude. Maybe I was reading too much into absolutely nothing. Still, it kept happening. Claire asked him questions. He answered them. Then his gaze drifted back toward me. Every single time. By the fourth or fifth glance, even she seemed to notice. She stopped talking for half a second before continuing her story with an amused little smile I couldn't quite understand. I suddenly felt like an extra in my own apartment, sitting only 15 feet away from two people who seemed perfectly comfortable while I could barely taste my food. The television played quietly in the background. Cars rolled past outside beneath glowing streetlights. Everything looked completely ordinary. Everything should have felt ordinary. But there was something strange hanging in the air. Something invisible that made every silence feel heavier than the conversation itself. I kept telling myself not to be ridiculous. Mason had brought a girl home. That should have answered every question I had spent almost 2 years refusing to ask myself. And yet, no matter how many times she smiled at him, no matter how many times she tried to hold his attention, whenever I looked up, Mason was already looking at me. I barely slept that night. The apartment walls were thin enough that I could hear faint conversations from the living room long after I retreated to my bedroom, but I never tried to make out the words. I told myself it was none of my business. Mason had every right to invite someone over. We had been roommates for almost 2 years, nothing more. At least that was the agreement we had silently lived by since the day we signed the lease. We split the rent down the middle, argued over whose turn it was to buy coffee, and somehow developed an unspoken rhythm that made living together surprisingly easy. Every weekday morning, Mason left the apartment at exactly 7:35 with a travel mug in one hand and a laptop bag over his shoulder. Every evening, unless work kept him late, he walked through the front door within 10 minutes of 6. He always kicked off his shoes in the same spot. He always asked if I had eaten dinner. He always remembered to replace the milk before it ran out because he knew I forgot almost every grocery trip. Somewhere between shared utility bills, late-night takeout, and countless movie nights neither of us admitted we actually enjoyed, the apartment had started feeling less like a rental and more like home. Maybe that was why seeing someone else sitting on our couch had unsettled me so much. The next morning I stepped into the kitchen expecting awkward silence, but instead I found Mason standing at the counter making pancakes. The familiar smell of butter filled the room. Claire was nowhere in sight. He looked up the moment I entered. There it was again. That same steady gaze that lingered just a second longer than it needed to. "Good morning," he said. "I made extra." I hesitated. "You did not have to." "I know." He slid a plate toward me anyway. "You usually skip breakfast after a bad night of sleep." I blinked. "How did you know I did not sleep well?" He shrugged, almost too casually. "Your coffee mug is already on the counter. You only make coffee before 7 when you cannot sleep." I looked at the mug. He was right. I had never noticed that pattern before, but somehow he had. "Where is Claire?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. "She left early." That was it. No explanation. No mention of another date. No smile that people usually wore after spending an evening getting to know someone they liked. He simply returned to flipping another pancake as though nothing unusual had happened. The silence stretched between us until I finally grabbed my plate and sat down. Every few seconds I caught him glancing in my direction again. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough that I started noticing it everywhere. When I reached for the syrup, he looked up. When I thanked him for breakfast, he watched me for another quiet second before nodding. It was beginning to feel impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, while I was organizing books in the living room, my phone buzzed with a message from my best friend Noah asking how my weekend was going. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for almost a minute before I finally typed. "Have you ever felt like someone was trying to tell you something without actually saying a single word?" Noah replied almost immediately. "That depends. Are they staring at you?" I stared at the screen, my heartbeat quickening for reasons I still refused to admit, because deep down I already knew the answer. I spent the rest of the weekend pretending everything was normal, but once your mind notices a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore it. Mason never actually did anything that crossed a line. He did not flirt. He did not ask personal questions. He simply noticed me. Monday morning, I reached for my keys before leaving for work, only to find them sitting neatly beside my wallet. I frowned. I was certain I had left them on the kitchen counter the night before. "You almost forgot those," Mason said while buttoning the cuff of his navy shirt. "I saw them this morning." "Thanks. You have a client meeting today, right?" I looked at him in surprise. "How did you remember that?" He shrugged with the same quiet expression he always wore. "You mentioned it last Thursday." Last Thursday. I barely remembered saying it myself. During lunch, Noah called me instead of texting. The second I answered, he skipped the small talk. "You are overthinking again, are you not?" "Probably. Tell me exactly what is happening." I sighed and leaned against the break room window. "He notices everything. Such as, if I skip breakfast, if I have a meeting, if I buy a new sweater, if I cut my hair. He remembers all of it." Noah laughed softly. "And you think that is normal roommate behavior? Maybe he is just observant." "Ethan." He paused just long enough for me to regret calling him. "Most people do not memorize someone else's schedule down to the hour." I had no response, because part of me knew he was right. That evening I arrived home first. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while I sat on the couch answering emails. About 20 minutes later, the front door opened. Mason stepped inside carrying 2 paper cups. He looked at me, smiled almost imperceptibly, then walked straight over. "Your favorite." He handed me a hot vanilla latte. The coffee shop was crowded, but they still had oat milk. I stared at the cup. "You remembered my order?" He looked genuinely confused. "Of course. I only mentioned it once. Actually, he said quietly, setting his own drink on the table. You order the same thing every Tuesday after payroll because you say it makes the afternoon feel less stressful. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I had never realized I even had that habit. Somehow he had. Before I could answer, his phone buzzed across the coffee table. The screen lit up for just a second. Claire. A new message. He glanced at it, tapped a quick reply without opening the conversation, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. I forced myself to look away. It should not have bothered me. If anything, it should have confirmed exactly what I had been trying to convince myself all weekend. He had someone else in his life. Whatever strange attention I thought I noticed meant absolutely nothing. So why did my chest still feel unexpectedly heavy? Later that night, I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. Mason was standing by the sink, absent-mindedly drying a plate. He looked up the instant I entered. Once again, his eyes found mine before anything else. Neither of us spoke. 5 seconds passed. Maybe 10. Finally, I cleared my throat. What? He blinked. What do you mean? You keep looking at me. His hands stopped moving. For the first time since we had met almost 2 years ago, Mason Carter looked completely caught off guard. But before he could answer, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, and something about his expression changed. Not disappointment, not excitement, more like reluctant acceptance. He slipped the phone into his pocket without replying this time, looked back at me as though he wanted to say something important, then quietly whispered, "It is complicated." The words stayed with me for the rest of the week. It is complicated. Mason never explained what he meant, and I never asked again. Maybe because I was afraid of the answer. Maybe because silence felt safer than hearing something that would finally force me to let go of the hope I had spent 2 years pretending did not exist. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. Pulled away. It started with small things. Instead of waiting for Mason to get home before eating dinner, I grabbed takeout on my way back from work. Instead of watching our favorite Wednesday night trivia show together, I stayed in my room with headphones on, even when I was not listening to anything. When he knocked on my bedroom door to ask whether I wanted to split a pizza, I answered that I was already full. It was not true, but it was easier than sitting across from him wondering why his eyes always searched for mine. At first, Mason seemed confused. He asked if work had become stressful. He wondered whether I was feeling sick. He even offered to help clean the apartment after noticing I had forgotten to empty the dishwasher. I thanked him politely every time, then found another excuse to leave the room. Days passed, and the distance between us grew in ways no one else would have noticed. We still said good morning. We still reminded each other when rent was due. We still lived under the same roof. But the apartment no longer felt warm, felt careful. On Friday evening, I stopped by the grocery store before heading home. While comparing 2 different brands of pasta sauce, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Ethan?" I turned around. Claire stood there holding a basket with fresh vegetables and a loaf of sourdough bread. She smiled the same easy smile I remembered from that first night. What a coincidence. "Hi," I answered, trying not to sound awkward. "Good to see you again." "Same here." She looked at my shopping basket and laughed softly. "Frozen dinners?" I glanced down, embarrassed. "Busy week. You should let Mason cook more often. He actually enjoys it." I blinked. "He told you that?" "No." She smiled knowingly. I have known him long enough to recognize the signs. We ended up standing near the produce section for almost 10 minutes, talking about work, the neighborhood, and how impossible downtown parking had become. She was funny, easy to talk to, nothing like the intimidating image I had built in my head. Just before we said goodbye, she tilted her head slightly and asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Did something happen between you and Mason?" My heart skipped. "Why would you ask that?" "Because he has been distracted all week." I forced a laugh. "Maybe work is busy." She looked at me for a long second before shaking her head. "No, it is something else." I waited, uncertain whether I even wanted to hear the rest. Claire sighed quietly, almost as though she had been debating whether to say anything at all. "The other night," she said. "While I was talking to him in your apartment." She paused, and a small amused smile appeared on her face. "I do not think he realized he was doing it." "Doing what?" She met my eyes with complete certainty. "Looking at you. Every single time you walked into the room, his attention followed you without him even noticing." "Honestly," she laughed softly to herself. I started feeling like the third wheel. Claire's words followed me all the way home. I started feeling like the third wheel. I replayed them over and over while unlocking the apartment door, hoping that if I examined every syllable closely enough, I would discover another meaning hidden beneath them. Instead, I found Mason sitting alone at the dining table with 2 bowls of homemade chicken noodle soup already waiting. He looked up the second I stepped inside, relief briefly crossing his face before settling back into his usual calm expression. "You are home," he said quietly. "I was starting to wonder if you were working late." I set my grocery bag on the counter. "I ran into someone." "Really? Claire?" For the first time in days, Mason looked genuinely surprised. "You did." I nodded and busied myself putting groceries away so I would not have to meet his eyes. "She seems nice." "She is." Silence settled between us again. I waited for him to tell me they had another date planned or that they had become closer after that evening. Instead, he simply stood there watching me organize vegetables into the refrigerator. Eventually he spoke. "I made your favorite soup." "You did not have to." "I wanted to." I swallowed before quietly answering, "I already ate." It was another lie. I could tell he knew it. His eyes drifted toward the unopened grocery bag where a package of uncooked pasta still sat on top. He did not argue. He simply nodded once and carried one of the bowls back into the kitchen. Something about that small movement hurt far more than I expected. The following week settled into an uncomfortable routine. We left for work at different times whenever possible. If I heard his key in the apartment door, I stayed in my room another 10 minutes. If he offered to watch a movie, I claimed I had deadlines. Every excuse came easier than explaining feelings I had never intended to admit out loud. Yet despite all the distance I tried to create, Mason continued noticing everything. One rainy morning my umbrella disappeared from the hallway closet. I found it later beside my work bag with a small note in his handwriting. "The forecast says heavy rain after 3. Do not forget this." Another evening I arrived home exhausted to discover my favorite blueberry yogurt already waiting in the refrigerator, because he remembered I had mentioned the grocery store near my office stopped carrying it. None of those gestures were dramatic. None of them proved anything. But together they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Noah noticed the change before anyone else. "You sound miserable," he said over the phone one evening. I thought avoiding him was supposed to make things easier. I stared out my bedroom window at the city lights shimmering after the rain. It did not. "Then what are you going to do?" I let out a slow breath. "Nothing. Nothing. If Claire is important to him, I have no right to complicate his life." Noah was quiet for a long moment. Finally he asked, "Did Mason ever actually tell you she was his girlfriend?" The question caught me off guard. "No." "Did you ask?" "No." "So everything you believe right now is something you decided on your own." After we hung up, I sat alone thinking about those words until nearly midnight. The apartment was silent except for the faint sound of Mason moving around the kitchen. For a brief moment I considered walking out there, sitting across from him, and asking the one question I had avoided for days. Instead, I turned off my bedroom light and stayed where I was, never realizing that just outside my closed door, Mason had paused in the hallway with a mug of hot tea in his hands, quietly debating whether tonight would finally be the night he found the courage to knock. Saturday arrived with unusually clear skies, and for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, neither Mason nor I had to work. I planned to spend the afternoon at a neighborhood bookstore just to avoid another day of awkward silence inside the apartment. I had barely finished my coffee when my phone buzzed. It was Claire. "Would you mind meeting me for lunch?" she asked. Curiosity won over hesitation, and an hour later I found myself sitting across from her at a quiet cafe a few blocks from the river. After ordering sandwiches, She smiled at me with the same relaxed expression she always seemed to have. "You look tired," she said. I laughed softly. It has been a long couple of weeks. For Mason too. Hearing his name immediately tightened something inside my chest. I stirred my iced tea without looking up. "Is everything all right?" Claire rested her elbows lightly on the table. "That depends on whether the two of you finally start talking to each other." I looked at her, completely confused. "What do you mean?" She blinked. "Wait. You really do not know?" "Know what?" For a moment she looked genuinely surprised. Then she let out a quiet sigh and shook her head. "I thought he would have told you by now." My heartbeat quickened. "Claire." She smiled apologetically. "First of all, I should probably clear up the biggest misunderstanding. Mason and I are not dating." I stared at her. "You are not." She laughed. "No. I cannot believe you actually thought that. But that night, I came over because my parents asked me to bring him family documents from my grandmother." She paused before adding, "Mason is my cousin." I felt as though the entire room had gone silent. Every assumption I had carefully built over the past 2 weeks crumbled in an instant. "Your cousin," I repeated. "Yes, we grew up together. We are practically siblings." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. "Then why?" Claire gave me a knowing smile before I even finished the question. "Why was he staring at you instead of paying attention to me?" I nodded slowly. She laughed again, warmer this time. "Believe me, I noticed. It became almost funny after a while." She reached for her drink before continuing. "I was telling him about my new job, and every time you walked through the apartment, his eyes followed you automatically. At one point, I actually stopped talking because I realized he had no idea what I had just said. I could not find the words to respond." Claire studied my expression for a moment before speaking more gently. "Ethan, I have known Mason my entire life. He has always been thoughtful, but I have never seen him pay attention to anyone the way he pays attention to you." My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if she could hear it across the table. "Then why has he never said anything?" Claire smiled with a mixture of amusement and sympathy. "Because he has been convinced for months that you only see him as a roommate. He told me he would rather stay your friend forever than risk making you uncomfortable and losing you completely." I lowered my eyes, suddenly remembering every breakfast he had made, every coffee he had memorized, every tiny detail he had quietly carried in his heart without expecting anything in return. Before I could say another word, Claire reached across the table and gently patted my hand. "I think the two of you have spent a very long time protecting each other from feelings that were never one-sided." Claire's words echoed in my mind the entire walk home. He would rather stay your friend forever than risk losing you completely. I had spent 2 weeks convincing myself that Mason was choosing someone else, while he had apparently spent months convincing himself that I would never choose him. The realization was almost unbearable. By the time I reached our apartment building, the afternoon sun had already begun to sink behind the skyline, painting the windows with soft shades of gold. I stood outside for several minutes before finally unlocking the front door. The apartment was unusually quiet. Mason was sitting on the balcony with a notebook resting on his lap, though he was not writing anything. He looked up the instant he heard me step inside. Just like always, his eyes found mine before anything else in the room. "You are back," he said with a small smile. "How was your afternoon?" I almost told him everything. I almost asked why he had never said a word. Instead, fear won again. "It was nice," I answered quietly before disappearing into my bedroom. I leaned against the closed door and covered my face with both hands. I could not keep doing this. Every conversation ended with silence. Every opportunity slipped away because neither of us wanted to be the first person to risk changing what we already had. That night, I opened my laptop and searched for apartment listings across the city. Maybe distance really was the only way forward. If I stayed, I would keep hoping. If I left, perhaps both of us could finally move on. The next morning, I printed a few rental applications before leaving for work. I never intended for Mason to see them, but when I returned that evening, the papers were no longer on my desk. My heart dropped. I walked into the living room and found him standing beside the window, the application forms resting in his hands. His expression was calm, but there was something fragile behind his eyes I had never seen before. "Are these yours?" he asked softly. I nodded. "You are moving?" I forced myself to answer. "I think it is time." He stared at the papers for several long seconds before looking back at me. "Did I do something wrong?" "No." "Then why?" I searched for an explanation that would not reveal too much. "I just think maybe we both need our own space." He let out a slow breath and carefully placed the papers on the table. "No," he said quietly. I blinked. "What?" "No." His voice was steadier this time, though I could hear emotion beneath every word. "I cannot pretend I am fine with this." It was the first time I had ever seen Mason struggle to stay composed. He ran one hand through his hair, looked toward the floor for a moment, then met my eyes again with complete honesty. "These last 2 weeks have been the hardest since we met." I could barely breathe. "I thought you were tired of living with me," he continued. "I kept trying to figure out what changed. Every day you pulled a little farther away, and every day I convinced myself I should respect your space, even though all I wanted was to ask you to stay." The room felt impossibly still. The city outside continued moving as if nothing extraordinary was happening, but inside our small apartment, everything we had hidden for nearly 2 years had finally begun breaking through the silence. Mason took one careful step closer and quietly admitted, "If you walk out because you found a better opportunity, I will support you. But if you are leaving because you think you do not matter to me, then I cannot let you believe that for one more day." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The rental applications remained on the coffee table between us like a decision waiting to be made, but suddenly they no longer felt like the most important thing in the room. I looked at Mason, and for the first time since we had met, the quiet certainty that had always defined him was gone. He looked nervous, vulnerable, human. I swallowed hard before finally asking the question I should have asked weeks ago. "Then why did you bring Claire here?" A faint, almost embarrassed smile appeared on his face. He rubbed the back of his neck before letting out a quiet laugh. "Because I made a terrible decision." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "I spent months trying to convince myself that what I felt would eventually disappear." He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. It did not. The apartment was so quiet that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Mason continued speaking carefully, choosing every word as though he had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his head. "Claire kept telling me that I needed to stop hiding from my feelings. I told her she was wrong. I told her you probably only saw me as a roommate. She suggested that maybe seeing me with someone else would finally show whether I was imagining everything." My eyes widened. "You were trying to make me jealous?" He immediately shook his head. "Not exactly. I was trying to prove to myself that I could move on." He smiled sadly. "Instead, I spent the entire evening looking at you because every time you walked into the room, I forgot Claire was even there." I could not help letting out a short, disbelieving laugh. "She told me that." Mason closed his eyes for a second. "Of course she did. She also told me she is your cousin." He sighed dramatically. "I was hoping to explain that myself before you figured it out from someone else. You waited too long." "I know." We stood there smiling awkwardly, both realizing how easily a simple misunderstanding had grown into weeks of unnecessary distance. After another quiet moment, Mason spoke again, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Do you know why I always noticed when you skipped breakfast?" I slowly shook my head. "Because I worried you would forget to take care of yourself." "Why did you always remember my coffee order?" "Because seeing you smile over something that small made my entire morning better." My chest tightened. "Why did you keep looking at me that night?" He answered without hesitation. "Because you were the person I wanted to spend the evening with." Every excuse I had built over the past 2 years disappeared at once. Every assumption collapsed beneath the honesty in his voice. I lowered my eyes for a moment before quietly admitting, "I thought you had finally found someone who could make you happy." Mason took one slow step closer. "Ethan." I looked up again. "I already had." The words settled gently between us, carrying none of the dramatic certainty I had imagined a confession would have. They were simple, honest, completely unmistakable. I felt myself smiling despite everything. "You really are terrible at communicating," I whispered. Mason laughed, relief finally replacing the tension in his expression. "I know." I laughed too. "Good, because I am just as bad." He looked at me with the same quiet expression that had confused me for weeks, except now I finally understood it. It had never been curiosity. It had never been habit. It had always been affection patiently waiting for the courage to become words. The next morning felt strangely familiar, yet completely different. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen window exactly as it had every other Saturday since we had moved into the apartment. But this time there was no invisible wall standing between us. I woke to the familiar smell of coffee and pancakes, smiled before I even opened my bedroom door, and found Mason standing at the stove exactly where he had stood so many mornings before. He looked up the moment he heard my footsteps, just like always, only this time, neither of us looked away. "Good morning," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "Good morning," I answered, realizing it was the easiest conversation we had shared in weeks. He placed my favorite mug on the table without asking what I wanted. I laughed quietly. "You still remembered." He raised one eyebrow. "I remember everything." Somehow, instead of making my heart ache, those words finally made it feel light. Breakfast turned into a long conversation that should have happened months earlier. We laughed about every misunderstanding that had grown larger simply because neither of us had been brave enough to ask simple questions. We admitted the moments we had each mistaken for rejection. Mason confessed he had almost told me how he felt dozens of times before deciding friendship was safer than losing me forever. I admitted I had convinced myself Claire was the person he had been waiting for all along. We both laughed when we realized an entire week of distance had been created by two people trying to protect each other. Later that afternoon, the rental applications were still sitting on the coffee table. Mason picked them up, looked at me, then quietly asked, "Do you still need these?" I smiled before taking the papers from his hands and feeding them into the small paper shredder beside my desk. The soft, mechanical sound filled the apartment for only a few seconds, but it felt like the end of an old chapter neither of us wanted anymore. A few days later, Claire stopped by again, carrying another paper bag from the same bakery downtown. She looked from Mason to me, immediately noticed the difference, and smiled so broadly that she did not even need to ask what had happened. "Finally," she said, laughing. "I was beginning to think the two of you would spend the next 10 years communicating entirely through meaningful eye contact." Mason covered his face in embarrassment while I laughed harder than I had in a very long time. Life slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm after that, except now every ordinary moment carried a new kind of happiness. We still argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash. We still forgot grocery items and watched movies neither of us admitted were our first choice. Mason still remembered my favorite coffee order without asking, and I still reminded him whenever he worked too late without taking a break. The apartment itself never changed. The same walls, the same windows, the same little kitchen where we had shared hundreds of quiet mornings. But somehow it no longer felt like a place where two roommates happened to live. It became the place where two people finally stopped hiding from the truth that had been quietly growing between them all along. Looking back now, I realized the biggest misunderstanding was never about Claire, or about that single evening that changed everything. It was believing that love always announces itself with grand speeches or dramatic moments. Sometimes it arrives much more quietly. It remembers how you take your coffee. It notices when you forget breakfast. It leaves your umbrella by the front door before it rains. And sometimes, in a room full of people, it keeps looking at only one person, hoping that one day they will finally understand why.